Good morning. Thank you for joining us today as we learn how we can collaborate and empower racialized communities through research. Please note, today's event is being recorded and automatic captioning is available by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Laurier's campuses are located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. Perhaps you're joining us from another location, and in that case, I'd like to encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water. My name is Janelle Campbell, and I'm a 2017 graduate from the MSW program, and I have over 15 years of experience in the social service sector. I am the owner and operator of self-wellness counseling and mental health services. I also provide webinars on anti-Black racism, and I also provide clinical supervision to social workers. Today's event is one of many hosted at Laurier in celebration of Black History Month, also known as African Heritage Month, celebrated all days of the year. Black History Month is an observance dedicated to remembering, celebrating, and visioning the activism, heritage, culture, and arts of Black people in the diaspora. People from the African continent and Caribbean and in the Americas and many generations on these lands in our shared histories. We began as a week-long educational initiative in the United States in 1926 by historian Carter G. Woodson, is now an international month-long event. The Canadian House of Commons officially designated February as Black History Month in 1995. This month is an important celebration that spotlights Black achievement in our intersecting identities, lived experiences, and shared truths, despite the predominant narrative of slavery and racism. The format for today's event is we'll begin with a panel conversation, followed by answering your questions. Please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box as we're speaking, and I'll post them shortly. I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Magnus Mfoafo M'Carthy and Dr. Ciann Wilson. Magnus is an associate professor in the Lyle S. Hallman Faculty of Social Work. His research focuses on community-based global mental health practice, disability, inclusive education, international social work, and Afrocentric social work practice. Magnus has held numerous Canadian and international research grants exploring stigma, mental health, and disability. He travels regularly to Ghana and other African countries where he is involved in research on mental health and disability. Ciann is an associate professor in the Faculty of Science. Her research program consists of community-based research projects that utilize evidence-based, art, and media-based approaches to elucidate community perspectives on their own health and engage communities in evidence-based interventions that have local specificity and relevance. She has extensive experience in consulting, advocacy, and community development related to Black and Indigenous health promotion and evaluation. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm looking forward to learning more about your work and experiences. To begin, can each of you please tell us about the focus of your research and what motivates you in your work?
Well, I'll start. I think I will start. And first and foremost, I would like to state the obvious, that I am a Black African scholar of Ghanaian descent who's engaged in Black scholarship in the diaspora. I'm not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. I'm quoting the former president of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. The focus of my research actually explores the nexus between community-based mental health and disability among vulnerable communities. I'm particularly interested in the impact of stigma on individuals diagnosed with mental illness in the global South, specifically Ghana and also a few other countries. And in terms of motivation, I would say there are two things that tend to motivate me in terms of what I do and it's something that I think about on a regular basis. Number one is the challenges faced by racialized folk in accessing mental health care in the global north and the global south as well. So just want to give you a little bit of data here. Some information that's been gathered by the Black Health Alliance, and it states that 60% of Blacks in Canada say that they'll be more willing to use mental health services if the mental health professionals who'll be working with them tend to be Black. 35.4% mentioned that they experience significant psychological distress. However, 34.2% of whom never seek mental health services. And the question we may want to ask is why? And there are numerous reasons for that. And these are some of the thought processes that go through my mind. And also 95.1% feel that states that the underutilization of mental health services by Black Canadian residents is an issue that ought to be addressed. So this is something that keeps me awake on a regular basis. And the second point had to do with the loss of a friend after high school in Ghana. When we finished sixth form, I mean, those days, we had the British system where you'd have to go through high school up to the sixth form level. And this individual happened to be the first person in his family to have qualified for university. So he had gained admission to study engineering in our Science and Technology University, a premier science and technology university. So we're all happy for him. However, prior to going to school, he started exhibiting symptoms of psychosis. I mean, he became a bit psychotic and started exhibiting the symptoms. So the family took him to the hospital, and well, he was treated somewhat, but in actual fact, when he came back, he wasn't the same. But all the same, he decided to go to school, and he did his first year. And towards the latter part of the first year, I think there was a relapse. And he was taken back to the hospital, and my understanding is eventually taken to a traditional medicine man. And through it all, to cut a long story short, we lost this friend of ours. And that was really a difficult thing. But one thing that really stood out for me was the fact that people didn't want to talk about what happened to him in terms of the illness. And they blamed it on his grandmother and the fact that people didn't want the well-being, and people were against the well-being of the family and started attributing this friend's death to witchcraft and other things. And at that age, I thought of perhaps doing something eventually that may help ameliorate or maybe mitigate some of these challenges that are faced by such cultures, particularly the Ghanaian culture and African culture, and I believe the Caribbean culture as a whole, or the Black culture as a whole. So these are what motivates me. So day in and day out in my research, I think about this friend that I lost and what is going on in our society right now. And these are the issues that really keep me up at night.
Thanks so much for that, Magnus. And it's like, I always, whenever you speak, it's like, how do I follow that? It's you know, I think just so well said in terms of lived experiences in being a Black woman myself. For my own work, what motivated my work was reading a lot of statistics. So I started out in particular in sexual and reproductive health work in when I started, you know, my research career very early on. HIV/AIDS was another sort of area of focus that really, you know, I think maps the start or the nexus of sort of my research career, if you will. But really quickly learning that Black communities in particular, Indigenous communities second to that, were often, statistics, right? We were overwhelmingly disproportionately represented in the HIV crisis, in the Canadian context, when it came to sexual and reproductive health or teen pregnancy. All of the negative sort of connotations of statistics were really overwhelming to contend with as a young Black woman, reading all of these statistics. And there was never any acknowledgement of systemic structures or colonization or systemic racism in impacting our health and well-being, and what the role of those things, those systemic and social determinants of health, if you will, the roles that those things played in our health outcomes. But we were always sort of, framed as a problem, risky Black bodies, if you will. I'm just going to focus on Black communities for the purpose of this conversation, but my work also includes Indigenous and racialized folks. But risky Black bodies is the way that we were consistently framed through statistics and through the research that I was reading. And being a young Black woman growing up and reading this and having this, impart many feelings and many thoughts about the ways in which, without context, and this happens all the time, research can be used to paint really deleterious pictures about entire groups of people that reaffirm and help to perpetuate racism in our society. So when you're reading statistics about health outcomes or socioeconomic outcomes or education outcomes, it reaffirms a lot of the negative stereotypes that in Canadian society, whether we like to acknowledge it or not, we already hold about Black people, right? And so being really challenged and really puzzled by these problematic statistics and the way in which they are framed as knowledge without the context of, well, what has been the role of the social determinants and the systemic factors on our health, of ongoing colonization in so many ways. And what have those things played? So when we could talk about risky bodies in one sense, but what puts us at risk is always the question for me. Our Black skin is not what puts us at risk. There are larger systemic factors at play in terms of why our communities are at risk. So that is the framing then of why, what motivates the work that I do, which is to center our perspectives as Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in my work. So my work, by and large, whether I'm working on a research protocol or I'm working on, for ethical engagement in research or ethically engaging Black people in research, or I'm working with Black and Indigenous communities or racialized communities around mental health, all of my work, I would say the congruent of thought, or the thing that ties the string of projects that I do together, is around centering our perspectives on our health and well-being. And this also comes from many traditions, some being Indigenous research traditions, Black feminist thought and tradition, which aims to center ourselves as fully human, as self-determining, as free and free-thinking people, and also as the solutions that we seek. And what I mean by that is we are, again, going back to this risk narrative, we're often trumped up to be risky bodies. My work aims to look at our solutions that we have within our communities. We have the solutions within our communities. We have the knowledge to solve our own problems. We do not need saviorism. That is not what we need. And often history has taught us and told us, our own history, Black history teaches us that we ultimately always end up saving ourselves, whether that is from bondage to the current moment, which is our own health and well-being. Ultimately, we save ourselves. We are the solutions that we seek. And so for me, a lot of my research focuses on our self-determination as peoples, as Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples, to center us as agents of change in the worlds that we live, in the lives that we lived in our lived experience, in our realities. And so that for me is sort of the impetus and the motivation for my work, and the way in which I conceptualize and frame the work that I do, and for me, why it's important and why it resists some of the structures, be they systemic, colonial, otherwise, that we're sort of nested within the larger sort of research enterprise that we do this work in.
Thank you guys very much for sharing. Our next question is, what are some of the methods and processes you use in your research?
Well, in terms of practice, my research, I'm a big proponent of collaborative research. And just want to use an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. So usually I employ phenomenology is really big, and also participatory research. That is big in what I do. So as part of what I do with phenomenology, what I tend to do is exploring the lived experiences of individuals who've been either diagnosed with mental illness or perhaps maybe those who have disability. And I deem that as an appropriate approach in working with them, because this is a systemic inquiry that emphasizes participation and action by members of the community who've been affected by that research. And I would want to quote something by Larry Shelton, who is an activist and a writer in the disability community, who says, "There is nothing about us without us." So there is no way people within that community can be engaged in research without and working with them together as co-creators of knowledge. So it involves collaboration with stakeholders and community members, or those with insider knowledge and lived experience. They may not necessarily be trained as researchers in the process, but their genuine and meaningful participation also helps to initiate change. Because as researchers, in fact, our goal is to bring change, either for the betterment or for services, or even change in policy for the individuals that we work with. So these are some of the things that we engage in. So based on my research, we used the social model, theoretical approaches like the social model of disability, the narrative life history approach, and a few others. So for instance, the social model, the beauty of the social model is the fact that it arose in reaction to the medical model of disability, which equated disability with impairment and called on expert intervention to normalize disabled persons. So the social model, the reason why I like the social model is that it directs attention towards the actions of disabled individuals and groups as active agents and not passive recipients of expert fixes. So these have been used in the past and it's really been helping out. And in terms of my projects, the numerous projects that we have in Ghana, we realized that engaging with individuals who either been diagnosed with mental illness or maybe have some form of disability really helps a great deal, because they also serve as gatekeepers, and that has really yielded a lot of good results.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Magnus. I think building on that, I would say that I definitely come from a community-based research training. So I would classify myself, although I work within a psychology department, a community-based health researcher, by and large is where I would sort of like, if I were going to categorize my work and the sort of like training that I come up in, which is community-based research, in that framework of engaging communities in a respectful and meaningful way, which is, how I frame community-based research. I also pull, as I mentioned, from Black feminist thought, Indigenous and decolonial thought, as well as critical ethnic studies, as some of just the areas of thought that inform the kind of scholarship that I'm immersed in terms of engaging communities in meaningful and beneficial research, and the meaningful part being meaningful relationships that I cultivate in the research process with my research team, with research participants. So creating a community and cultivating a collective of people who are working on projects, all the way to the way that we frame this work out and actually the methods that we employ. And so some of those methods are quantitative, some are qualitative. We do everything from survey design to interviews and focus groups. We also do art and digital media work. So I've established here with the support of provincial funding from the Canadian Innovation of Federation for Innovation Research, as well as Laurier Arts and Digital Media Hub here through through the Center for Research for Community Research Funding and Action, Carla. So we actually do have an arts and digital media hub here of work, and so my work does actually center a lot of those methods as well. And I do gravitate towards arts and digital media work in working with young people, in working with communities where English may not be the first language, where we have to cross language barriers, we have to cross cultural barriers. I find that arts and digital media work really resonates with various cultures, with various groups of people. It also is very much in keeping with Indigenous pedagogy, with orative traditions. And so I do find that those methods and modalities are really, really helpful for the communities that I'm working with. In addition to layering on qualitative and quantitative research and the theoretical frameworks that I've mentioned that I sort of pull from in terms of framing some of that work. And so in a nutshell, that's some of the approaches that I take for the research that I do, and the reasons that I use those approaches is around their accessibility for diverse, rich and diverse communities.
Thank you very much. I love the passion that both of you have when it comes to your research. It's very inspiring. Thank you for that. Before I post the next question, just a reminder to let everyone know that if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and I will definitely read them once it's time for the answer, once it's time for that period. So for the next question, based on your research and your lived experiences, what are some of the greatest challenges faced by Black people in our communities?
Right, thank you, Janelle. I think I would approach this question from two angles. I'll look at Ghana, or maybe representing the continent of Africa, and also look at what's happening in the Western world, that is the global North. In Ghana, I would say the main challenge that I find facing a lot of the clients or individuals that I work with has to do with this idea of stigma. The fact that in a culture, if you identify as having any form of mental illness, or even you have any form of disability, you are excluded. It prevents you from being able to achieve tons in life. This has led to a lot of people committing suicide because there's no outlet. There's no place for them to really voice their issues and the concerns that they're going through. There are families that tend to even lock family members in their homes because they don't want to associate, or even people within the community to know this is happening. Based on my research, I've come across people who even talk about, even when they're going to get married, family members do investigation into their families to find out if they have anyone with mental illness. So it's really a serious concern. And these are some of the challenges that I feel that we need to find ways of addressing, so that at least we'll feel comfortable talking about mental health issues. Because I always hold on to this idea, there's nothing like health without mental health. And that is my focus. And that is something that I always talk about when I meet with people, when I'm giving presentations and other things in Ghana. Now, moving to Canada, I will say this, that in actual fact, the major issue that a lot of the people that we interact with talk about has to do with the issue of racism, that is the color of their skin. I've had participants sharing that even the mere fact that people of color having a Black skin even creates depression and anxiety, because you need to even have a certain sense, thought process when you step out of your home, because you are a different person. When you interact with the police, when you interact with people, even at the market, school, workplace, and other things, you wonder what is going on. And in nature of our research, we find research that talks about a lot of these things happening. And also the fear, the conscious of being out of home, the fact that perhaps you'll be stopped while driving, and other things creates all kinds of problems. So these are some of the challenges that a lot of the people that I deal with tend to talk about. And also the issue of even being a racialized person even increases the tendency for you to have mental illness. And I think we know of reports of people who perhaps maybe have experienced some form of mental health conditions or situations, or maybe the police being called into homes where perhaps maybe the outcome that wasn't the best. They either got called, they got shot, or maybe it turned out worse. So it's really a major concern. And anytime I talk about these things, it reminds me of a statement that was made, a comment that was made by Dr. Paul Farmer. He died recently. He was the chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda, and he used to be a professor at Harvard University. He says, evidence shows that racism, especially anti-Black racism, kills. And it's not only bullets. Denial of essential goods and services can also kill. And because we tend to patients of every description, we know that racism ruins our ability to provide excellent care for all, just as its corrosive effects damage our professional communities from within. So I think I'll end with this. Thank you.
And I will pick up right where Magnus has left off. I would have to say that whether I'm doing work in education, where I'm seeing different outcomes for Indigenous and Black kids as a result of lowered expectations by educators, and like larger or higher, punitive measures being taken with Indigenous and Black kids versus other kids. So we see that in education, in the criminal and justice system, we know that we have disproportionate, rates in terms of Black representation in the prison system, as well as Indigenous folks as well. Again, we know that of the last 100 people murdered by or killed by police or at the hands of police brutality, we know that they've been disproportionately Indigenous and Black people. Child welfare, very similarly, we know our kids are being taken away from us at astronomical levels in relation to other groups of people. When we look at health, Magnus just highlighted mental health. Well, when you look at health care, we know that we report as Black people lower quality of care and less trust with our healthcare providers here in Canada. And so I'd have to echo that anti-Black racism for me, and racism more generally when we're talking about Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, is probably one of the biggest issues that our communities face, especially in a society like the Canadian society, where we do not acknowledge that racism exists here too. We always point to our southern neighbors in the United States to sort of almost like this exceptionalism, like the United States is so much worse because of the racism happening there. I can say wholeheartedly, as a Black woman who has faced racism in my own lived experience, that I would rather somebody tell me they do not like me because of the color of my skin than pretend they like me to my face. But behind my back, there are all kinds of things happening in terms of undermining me in my role, in my position, in what I'm doing, in my efforts. And so they call Canadian racism, quote unquote, polite racism. I don't know that there's such a thing as polite racism, number one. Number two, I would much rather know upfront what I'm dealing with than this facade of inclusivity and acceptance, only to have undermining actions occur instead. And I think that what I would describe Canadian racism as is it's passive aggressive in its temperament. It's covert. We don't talk about it. We don't use language to describe what's going on. But by and large, you're hearing from two Black researchers here that the overwhelming problem we're seeing in the communities that we face, that we work with, is racism. This is the issue that our communities are facing, and I will talk specifically about the Black community in saying that anti-Black racism is particularly violent and has a particularly different brand and sort of, I think, virulence to it in terms of how Black-skinned people and deeply melanated African people are treated in this particular context. And I think that that's something that's worthwhile unpacking in terms of not only what anti-Black racism looks like, but its impact on not only mental health, but I think our overall well-being. And we're seeing overwhelming evidence coming out of epigenetics research that is also showing the impact of racist violence at even a genetic and a cellular level, all the way up to our conscious, mental health level as well. And so really connecting those things in terms of the different bodies of research that are actually showing very, very, deeply, revealing things about the impact of racist violence.
Thank you, Magnus and Ciann, for sharing. That's very insightful. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your experiences. And we're going to transition to questions from the audience. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them. So let's get to the first question. Thank you for sharing. This is from Anonymous. This is just to share my thoughts. As a Black person, I find that I take the extra time to know who my daughter is going out with, if they are white friends. This is because if something happens while they're out, she may be the first suspect because of her skin color. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And there are so many measures that we take as parents, as Black people, to protect ourselves ultimately, right? For me, one of the measures that I've taken is, if I notice that there are microaggressions, racist microaggressions being directed at me by particular people, I sort of take a distance. I distance myself socially. That way I cannot be implicated in anything pertaining to that person. For me, social distancing is really important, not just for COVID, but actually for protection in terms of the racism and microaggressions that I face. So I think it's unfortunate that we have to take these protective measures, but we do to survive.
Yeah, and I think we live in a society where we need to continue trumpeting these issues, because it's important. It's something we can't run away from. Just this morning, I read a newspaper article about an incident in our region here where the police was called on a 4-year-old because a kid was misbehaving in school. 4-year-old, I think it's really traumatizing. And if you're not very careful, this is something that is going to impact this kid for the remainder of his or her life, you know. So I would think we need a lot of education. And I think as racialized folk, it's also important for us to continue, you know, educating, continue letting people know what's happening, you know, because there are times people feel that because maybe we have attended a couple of workshops and other things, they are familiar with issues relating to anti-Black racism. But until you walk in the shoes of a racialized person, you've never really experienced what they go through on a daily basis, you know, and that is where the issues are, you know. So it's really, really important that we continue having such conversations. And also, I think my dean made a comment. I think she did a write-up the other day and I was reading it. And I thought it was really interesting. She talked about, questioned why a month should be set aside for Black history. It should be 12 months as well. I mean, we need to learn it on a regular basis. But as we always say, if we have 1 month, we have to take it. Hopefully, maybe down the road, it's going to be 2 months and it's going to increase. So I think we need to continue with these conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. The next question is, when reading articles that reaffirm negative stereotypes, it's easier to just follow the article/thought. How could you delve a bit deeper into shifting our thoughts?
I think it's a great question. I've actually seen this, especially with with students, you know, impressionable students who are taking in this content and this research that is uncontextualized, it's uncritical, it doesn't, you know, unpack, you know, what puts people at risk, what you know, permits certain, you know, communities or groups of people to perform, let's say, lower in educational outcomes or targeted by the criminal and justice system. We don't unpack the reasons for that. I would encourage, you know, and these are just approaches that I use with my own students who I've seen struggle with this, including Black students, right? Because we have to remember, you know, even our education system perpetuates this way of thinking, right? About Black and racialized and Indigenous people. And so our students are also learning to think this way about themselves and people who look like them. And I can only begin, you know, we don't have a lot of time today, but you can only imagine what that does to the psyche of one when you're learning from, you know, again, the status quo about how to think about yourself and other people who look like you, right? And you're learning from the status quo how you're discussed, how you're labeled, you're at risk, you're this, you're that. And you then reflect on your own life, as I did as a young emerging scholar. And you're like, well, my life doesn't look like that. You know, my mom and dad have been very supportive. They made sure I knew my ancestry, my history, my roots, all of these things. That education was important. None of the things that I was reading about reflected my lived reality as a Black person in Canada. And so I think that we really have to encourage critical thought in our students by questioning and perturbing for them, unpacking the articles and the content that they're reading, you know, problematizing it. And more importantly than problematizing this stuff, what I encourage educators to do is not just assign problematic work for the sake of assigning problematic you know, things to read in the classroom. I also encourage you to go out, seek Black, Indigenous, and racialized scholars' work. I encourage you to center that work in your classes and in your curriculum, you know, and problematize arguments or maybe worldviews or perspectives that need to be problematized in the classroom. I encourage that. It's only through that kind of you know, deeply critical you know, process that we will perturb, you know, the overwhelming sort of discourse in academia, in the Western Academy about Black, Indigenous, and racialized people is to question and to problematize these things, and to also center the perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and racialized scholars in our curriculum and in our classrooms.
I agree with you, Ciann, and you've said it well. And also just want to add this bit to it. More often than not, the question we need to ask ourselves is, when through the educational system, a lot of the texts or materials that students use in class and other things are really Eurocentric or written by people from the dominant group. So more often than not, even though majority may be sensitive to issues of race and what have you, because they do not have that lived experience, so they tend to interpret things from their point of view. I've had people make comments like, well, if only you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and what I always tell people is, well, you've not walked in people's shoes. The question is, and to borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King, late Martin Luther King, what he said is, what if by pulling myself up by my bootstraps, I don't even have a leg? And that speaks to inequities in our society and the importance that we need to look at things from that perspective. When you use those lens, we wouldn't really come to that point of maybe putting people down or thinking they are not perhaps maybe educated enough or smart enough or what have you. So I'll put it that way.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. The next question, I think it's for you, Ciann. Could you speak a bit more to your arts and media work and how you use that to build community?
Yeah, thanks so much. I actually was just doing a presentation at York University about this. So how do I use this work? So I'll talk specifically about the work that I lead for the Proclaiming Our Roots project, which is a project that focuses on the histories and realities of people who are of mixed ancestry, of mixed Indigenous and Black ancestry, so Afro-Indigenous people here on Turtle Island. And that project actually incorporates the work of digital storytelling as one arts-based approach that we employ. And so in that process, we actually hired a Black digital storytelling facilitator to take us through creating these personal videos of experience. So essentially each participant in that process was able to put together images and text and music and voice to tell in a short little 5-minute video, a little bit about themselves, a little snippet about themselves. And so participants, chose to tell stories about their relationship to their grandparents and how their grandparents imbued Indigenous and African, pride in them and culture and traditions. Other folks talked about their relationships to their family and communities, and how that, again, reaffirmed for them a sense of self and a sense of purpose. And so I definitely encourage you, if you haven't, if you don't know about the Proclaiming Our Roots project, definitely check out the videos that were created there. proclaimingourroots.com is our website. We also have a YouTube page to check out those videos, but these are some of the ways that I incorporate the arts and digital storytelling being one art form. As an example, in terms of, again, centering the histories, stories, lived experience of Black and Indigenous and racialized people, and in this case, Afro-Indigenous people, and our histories and our realities. And also, it's really important because in a larger discourse in the Canadian sort of, context where these stories are not told, this history is not told. African and Black people are always assumed to have just arrived. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Jamaica, but not all people just arrived and are first-generation immigrants from Jamaica. We have people who have lived here for generations, right? As Isaac, one of our participants' story tells of several generations in country of being Afro-Indigenous, and he tells of his story. And so really perturbing and diversifying our understanding of Blackness in Canada and the rich history and rich relationships between Black and Indigenous people through struggle to oppose colonial struggle. So whether it was Mi'kmaq communities marrying Black loyalists in the East Coast to obstruct colonial rule, as well as the sort of a removal of Indigenous children from their homes. A lot of Indigenous folks married Black folks to protect their kids from being taken, because if your kid was mixed with Black, there was less of a chance that your kid was going to be, taken from you, as an example of a strategy that was employed. All the way, throughout the Underground Railroad, for example, where communities banded together to support each other through struggle or the escapement of enslavement. One of the stories that one of our Indigenous Black knowledge keepers, Curtis Bell, who lives in the Hamilton area, tells is the fact that the first Underground Railroad, which we never learn about, is not one of white folks, helping enslaved African people come through the Underground Passage from the United States. But in fact, from Curtis Bell's own history and knowledge, some of the first routes and waterways through the Iroquois Confederacy, because Iroquois people knew that they could travel back and forth across the Great Lakes and through the riverways unbothered by white settlers, actually would hide enslaved folks in their canoes and get them through the passageways of the Great Lakes and the rivers. And so from Curtis Bell's perspective as a knowledge keeper on this territory, and an Indigenous Black man from these lands, he knows from his own family history that the first Underground Railroad was not one led by white folks. It was actually one that was it was a collaboration between Indigenous folks and Black folks. So there's so much history here that we don't know about, that we don't talk about in terms of Afro-Indigenous history. And through storytelling, through the arts, through digital storytelling, these are some of the ways that I center, those realities in some of the work that I'm really privileged and honored to be a part of leading in a larger team of really fabulous, amazing Indigenous Black people.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Magnus, the next question is for you. Magnus, why have you chosen to focus a lot of your research efforts within your home country of Ghana? How does it feel to remain engaged with your community from abroad?
Thank you very much for the question, Janelle. Well, I must say, the reason why I'm really engaged in research in Ghana is I see it as a way of giving back to my country, a way of giving back to my community. Number one, Ghana, I've really benefited a lot throughout my education. I mean, there were certain stages in my life where I didn't have to pay tuition. And I wondered if I would have been where I am today had it not been these opportunities that had come my way. So I feel that despite all that is going on, I think it's really important for us to be able to maybe address some of the issues that I deem a challenge for the community. And looking at it from that perspective, it's not only Ghana per se. I mean, I've done some work in Eswatini, doing some work in Botswana and other parts of Africa. So my goal is for the continent as a whole. Even within Canada, prior to going for my doctorate, I worked at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health for a number of years. And I did a lot of engagement in the community, because I worked in the community treatment order program, where we provided support for individuals who are deemed with who are diagnosed with serious mental illness. So in terms of research and work, I continue to engage in this community on a regular basis. At the moment, we have a SHEC-funded project that is looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the psychosocial, the psychosocial well-being of immigrants in the country. So it's good both ways, I must say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Magnus. And our next question is, what do you think are the best ways to educate our children on racism so it does not negatively impact their self-esteem?
You want to take that first, Magnus, or shall I go?
Go ahead. I will join.
Yeah, I think, and we heard one person, talk about one question or one comment where a person prepared, themselves, for dealing with racism by getting to know their kids' friends. The reality is that we live in a racist society, and we do have to help our kids prepare for that. What they're going to potentially face when they go to school, when they're interacting with their friends, when they're just doing leisure activities. So whether that's with the police, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's wherever that experience might pop up, we do unfortunately have to do the tough work of preparing our kids for the reality that they live in as Black-skinned people. And how they are viewed in this world. And so my biggest advice for folks, who are parents of Black children is to start slowly having those conversations about what racism is, potentially the words that the really, unkind words that their classmates or their peers might use towards them, the negative connotations of the words, the meanings of those words, the fact that we, for example, we don't adhere to certain derogatory language, and we don't answer to that language because it has this long, ugly history that is not, is not becoming, it's not actually a positive thing. So even teaching our children initially about language, and how, how we identify ourselves, whether that be Black people, whether that be Caribbean or Ghanaian, however you would like your children to identify their Black identity. So how we do identify ourselves and the ways that we don't identify ourselves. So the derogatory language that we don't answer to, the derogatory language that we will not stand for, that we will, make sure that the teacher or the principal is aware of, if that language is ever used towards us. These are some of the important ways that I think that we can prepare our kids for the reality, which is that, we live in, Laurier is located, for example, in Waterloo region, which is, still a predominantly white region. And there is a lot of racism in schools. And I know this just in virtue of the work that I do, and the connections I have through Waterloo Region District School Board. And so the reality is that our kids are likely going to face racism in schools and are going to probably come across racist, expressions amongst their peers. And so we've got to prepare them for the language that they might come across and how to respond, which is to make sure that that is documented, tell a teacher, tell you as a parent, make sure that they're supported in getting through those processes as well. So that's just my advice in terms of what I'm seeing happen on the ground actively as we speak through our schools as a parent, as well as my advice in terms of how other communities, including African American communities, have prepared their own children for what they face when they leave and walk out the door. So yeah, that would be my advice.
So, and I agree with what Ciann just shared. And I think it's really the onus is on us as parents to train our children to be resilient, being able to understand, know who they are, and also having that confidence in themselves. Because no matter how you cut it, these things are going to be happening. We live in a very difficult and a challenging world, especially when you're a racialized person. And no matter how you cut it, you're definitely going to encounter some of these things. So as we always say, charity begins at home. We need to continue letting them know who they are, and also feeling proud of who they are and where they come from, understanding their culture, and things like that. I've heard stories, about children, particularly Black kids, going to school and people touching their hair and playing with their hair and saying all kinds of things about their hair. These are things we need to teach our children about and let them know who they are. If they are confident in themselves, yes, they're not going to allow these things to get to them, or perhaps maybe they find avenues in terms of reaching out to parents and having this conversation with them. Another news article that I read this morning had to do with the chair of the psychiatry department of Columbia University, to surprise you, has been put on suspension. He's been suspended because he sent a racialized tweet. So in actual fact, the issues of racism, it's not only within perhaps maybe ignorant people, even well-educated people engage in this trawl. So it's important for us to educate our children, let them know who they are and where they come from, and also be there for them as parents, be supportive of them.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I think Magnus just elucidated some really great examples of some of the troubling realities in schools. So I'll just add to some examples of that, because I think, again, it helps to solidify how racism operates for Black people still in this country and in our education system. I know, for example, young people who've had their hair shaved in the classroom by white instructors who didn't want to deal with their hair. It actively in the school, that has happened in young, this person is maybe 20 years old now. So the generation of university students are peers to this person. I've had young people tell me that when, for example, a white student utters the N-word or a racist or derogatory word towards them, and then they, out of defense, try to confront the white student just has to go to the principal and complain, and they are the ones who get penalized and are suspended or whatever the case may be. And white administrators and teachers not really understanding what how racism played an issue in that, and that the Black student was in fact responsive, not the person who instigated the issue. So these are real live examples that happen in our school system, even now in our university systems as well. We know of the videos of anti-Black Islamophobia that have happened, or racist and derogatory language that are mentioned amongst our university students. So these are issues that we have to contend with all the way from elementary all the way up to university, in terms of how to cultivate educational environments that are intolerant of racism, but are also educational spaces where non-Black and non-racialized and non-Indigenous people and students can learn how to properly and appropriately and respectfully engage with difference. And that's really, really important, again, in a society that is predominantly white, that we need to be, I think that the society needs to be open, and we as educational institutions need to be the vehicle for opening up the minds of engaging with difference in a respectful way and a meaningful way.
Thank you very much for that. We definitely appreciate your knowledge and expertise. The next question that we have let's see, sorry about that. How has / can your research translate into shaping and shifting public service and policy?
Well, I can start. Yeah, there's a lot that has really happened. I think it stems from our point of view. I think perhaps maybe Ciann would also agree with me in terms of perhaps maybe publications and also dissemination in terms of maybe presenting at conferences and other things, and ensuring that perhaps maybe policymakers are aware of a lot of these things that, recommendations that we are making. So for instance, with regard to a lot of my research in Ghana, what had happened is there was a recent article that we wrote on stigma and mental health in Ghana. And there was this newspaper that picked it up. They call it The Conversation. It's really centered on Africa. And they wanted us to really write some aspect of it with regard to policy changes and other things. And they distributed it over the continent. And I believe that a lot of people are really reading it. So aside from that, also ensuring that perhaps maybe when we get a chance in terms of meeting policymakers, talking to them and addressing some of these things. So I can say for sure that a lot of the projects that we are working on, particularly in Ghana, for instance, is gaining traction. And also in this part of the world, some of the work that I've done with community treatment orders and other things, there have been a number of publications, and also there have been talk about making changes in terms of even how to deal with racialized clients differently, not seeing them as maybe part of the mainstream, but at least knowing or understanding the culture, the background, where they're coming from. So you're not using the same brush for every client or every person who walks through the doors of the mental health system. So yes, in terms of changes and policy implementation and other things, it may be slow, but I think that we are in the process of really getting somewhere.
Yeah, I can say that some of the work that so in addition to all of those wonderful ways in which we sort of promote our work through the sort of traditional academic channels, all the way, to policy, some of the ways that I, as a community-based researcher, incorporate and plan for change is that I also really intentionally think about my research team composition. So, who's on the research team? Are there people who lead organizations, local nonprofits, or are policymakers maybe themselves that are a part of the team? Maybe doctors or trained professionals in that sense. So I think about the composition of my community-based team. So that's one way I intentionally plan for change, is when you comprise a team of different stakeholders, intentionally, or maybe it's not the team, but it's a advisory committee of stakeholders that can push for change in their own realms. That's one of the ways that you can impact, you can mobilize the outcomes of your research outputs, because the people who are the stakeholders who are going to take this work to the next phase are already embedded in your research process, right? They're either a part of the team, or maybe they're a part of the advisory committee, and they're the ones who are going to take these findings and operationalize them in their own world. So I think about the composition of the team as one way that we can be intentional, even from the start of a study, in thinking about the ways that we can operationalize. So in community-based research practice, it's very, very common to see nonprofit stakeholders or maybe funders. In some cases, in one of the studies that Dr. Marek Hurst and I lead, we have the Ontario Trillium as a partner, a funding body as a partner. So really thinking about that. Is being intentional about the teams that you're putting together to operationalize and move research findings beyond the scope of the study, and that they'll put them to work in their own worlds. Also thinking about clever ways to share that information. So Magnus just shared some, which was through articles and presentations. I do a lot of community gatherings, so I get community members together, and we host. I've hosted many community gatherings, in the communities that I've had research take part in. So going back to, for example, Halifax, and hosting community launches of project outputs and sharing information that way through reports. That's another one. So not just academic papers, but also community reports that can be operationalized and used by policymakers or programmers or in different worlds beyond the academy. So thinking about ways in which, one, the worlds outside of the academy, how do they translate knowledge, and what knowledge and in what ways way can we convey research findings in a way that is intelligible to them so they can use our research outputs to operationalize those findings. So that's always what I encourage researchers to think about as you're thinking about the ways to operationalize your research, is think about, well, what do you want your research to do? In what world? In what different world? So is it the business world? Is it, the health world? Is it whatever that is? And how do they convey knowledge? And therefore you can then create outputs that are intelligible. So maybe it's, maybe it's an infographic, maybe it's a report, maybe it's a community launch, maybe it's incorporating policymakers from the beginning to help you think through some of that in your research process. So that's just some of the advice that I would give for folks thinking about how to, translate and how I do this work myself in a lot of my studies.
Thank you very much. And we have time for one last question. So this question, as a new researcher who is racialized in a medical profession that is predominantly white, what advice do you have about proceeding into academia? I feel as though I'm constantly worried that my work that centers social justice curriculum development and implementation is wanted by academia, but is also scrutinized in a way that I cannot articulate. My guard is always on level 10. Any suggestions would be appreciated.
I think this is a common problem for a lot of folks. A lot of people, and I say this in a lot of spaces. Currently, I still am, the only Black researcher or scholar in the sciences here, for example. I am the only Black community psychologist right now, in the country, I think, who's working in the community psychology area, which is, again, in 2022, these are all really surprising things. And often we are going to be the first in our fields, in our disciplines, to be sort of pushing the envelope in terms of our research and the work that we're doing. So this is a very common problem. Number one is the first thing that I'll sort of acknowledge here. The piece around, seeking validity in our fields. Sometimes and oftentimes, especially in fields that are really traditional, I was just talking to someone who's in philosophy, for example, and doing Black philosophy and the challenges around that. So really traditional disciplines, it can be really tough to push the envelope, and being the first to be doing that, all of that brunt and all of that work and labor now rests on your shoulders. Right. And so I definitely, that challenge resonates with me so much. And I totally get that. I think my encouragement is, as you highlighted, as the person who asked the question highlighted, it's necessary work, it's needed work. The fact that you were the first doing it is not easy. It's not going to be kind. It's not going to be anything but onerous for you. But know that your work matters. It is necessary. It is needed to push the envelope, the field, the discipline, scholarship forward. And my encouragement to you is to keep on, and also to find other scholars beyond your discipline. So get beyond disciplines. It says the interdisciplinary scholar, by the way. So the interdisciplinary scholar is telling you to move beyond your discipline, find folks that think like you, who do work like you, who encourage you to vibe off of, to work alongside, to encourage you and uplift the kind of scholarship that you're trying to do, and the sort of new innovative path that you're trying to pave in your discipline. Unfortunately, those are some of the places that we've had to go. I am a traditionally trained community health researcher, trained in environmental health. And I find myself in community psychology, right? And one of the only English-speaking community psychology program in the country. So think beyond your discipline, find folks that think like you, that do work that is similar, or that even just folks that are encouraging. So maybe they don't do any work like you, but they're encouraging and they're positive, because that's the kind of reinforcement and reaffirmation that we need in order to fight the daily battles that we do in our disciplines and in research and in the academy more generally. And so I encourage you to find those spaces where you find that encouragement and where you get that encouragement.
Thank you, Ciann. And also, I would say that keep at it. No matter how you cut it, these challenges are going to be there. I remember when I started my program, one of the advice my mentors gave me was, well, Magnus, you need to work twice as much as your colleagues. And I thought this person was kidding, but I realized that it's really true. No matter how you cut it, people may doubt you. No matter where you go, people may try to even erase you for who you are. But like Ciann said, I would encourage you to really have that confidence and know that you're at a very good place. Even in academia, in terms of publications and other things, more often than not, publications from racialized folk, particularly on Africa and other things, are not well embraced by journals. But definitely we need to continue doing it, right? So no matter how it is, that is the nature of the world, particularly in a capitalist world where, power plays a very important role. But I think you're on a cusp of something wonderful, and I would encourage you to keep at it. Keep it up. And the more you reach out to people, the more you continue engaging in some of these research and some of this work, to surprise you where you'd go. Because no matter how one casts it, there's always that groundbreaking. We need somebody who needs to take that initiative, to bring change. And if we do decide to give up, perhaps maybe you'll not be able to get to where you would expect it to be. So I encourage you to continue. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Magnus and Ciann. It was a pleasure. As that was our last question, do you guys have any last comments to share with the audience?
I think I'll just, thank everyone for their attention today. We talked about some really difficult topics, everything from education, our children, all the way to how we, cut out and carve out spaces for ourselves as Black scholars in the academy. None of these topics are easy. And for those of us living these realities, even more so, it's such a difficult, they're all very difficult, loaded questions and conversations that are very emotionally fraught. They're hard fraught conversations for Black identifying people who know intimately what it is to face anti-Black racism in the workplace and to have to carve out and work endlessly and tirelessly to carve out those spaces, not only for ourselves, but also for our students, which folks don't always think about. The amount of unpaid labor that I do as a scholar, and I'm sure Magnus can speak to his own experiences of supporting students and getting them through systems that, are really challenging our students, just getting them through a PhD or a master's program is very difficult, especially when our students are also trying to carve out new areas of research and inquiry that may not be typically upheld in the academy or supported. And so I say all that to say that none of these conversations are easy, and I recognize that. And I also thank you, for making this space, Janelle and company, and the entire team behind this here at Laurier for making space. And I read a lot of the questions and interpreted them as a lot of racialized and Black and Indigenous folks asking the questions. So I thank you for making a space where folks felt comfortable to voice those questions and concerns, where we as Black scholars could respond to Black respondents who were talking about lived experience, and for cultivating this space. I'm grateful.
I echo Ciann, and I want to say a big thank you for giving us a space. I realized for a couple of years now that I think the space has really been provided at Laurier for engaging in some of these conversations. And I want to say a big thank you to our president, Deb McClatchy, and also Mary and the team. You are very much appreciated, and I believe, my hope is that this would not end here or be a 9-day wonder, as we say it, but would continue that process of engagement. Because in actual fact, a journey of 1,000 miles, as we say, starts with a step. And personally, I consider this to be perhaps a couple of steps that we've taken, and we have a long way to go. So let's keep at it. And also in terms of research and other things, I just want to end with a quote from Toni Morrison, who says that we are not, or you are not the work that you do. You are the person that you are. So we've all been molded or born, raised differently and what have you. So the work do not really define who we are, but at least it's part of the journey that we are embarking on. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone.
Thank you to everyone for participating. Magnus and Ciann, thank you for participating in our inspiring conversation. It was a pleasure. I personally learned a lot. Thank you all to who have attended, listened, and posed questions. And our next conversation will occur on March 23rd. Topic will be Seeking Shelter, Alternative Approaches to Housing. Thank you, everyone.